Hi, this is Estelle Erasmus, your host for Freelance Writing Direct. In this short soundbite-filled podcast, I'll cover everything the freelance and creative writer and author needs to do to move forward with their writing, their creativity, and their career. Through conversations with guests, we'll cover tips, tricks, and actionable strategies. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes and Spotify. Hi, everybody. It's Estelle Erasmus, and I'm so thrilled to announce that my book, Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, is out and available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, and wherever books are sold. So I would love it if you'd pick up a copy, and I think you'll learn a lot. Thanks. Bye-bye. Hi, everybody. This is your host, Estelle Erasmus, and this is Freelance Writing Direct. And today I am so happy to have Brendan Spiegel with us from Narratively. And the episode is titled A Deep Dive into Narratively with Brendan Spiegel. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And I want to tell you a little bit about Brendan. He's the co-founder and editorial director at Narratively. A New York City native, Brendan got his start in journalism as a political reporter and editor at Congressional Quarterly in Washington, D.C. His articles on food, travel, politics, news, and humans have appeared frequently in the New York Times, as well as the Washington Post, Wired, New York Magazine, Travel and Leisure, and many other publications. And you can follow him at Brendan Spiegel on Twitter, and Narratively can be followed at Narratively on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And I'll put all of the links in the show notes. And I was honored to work with Brendan a couple of years ago when I was the guest editor for Narratively, and I worked on several of the pieces, and it's just always been a pleasure working with you. So welcome to the program, Brendan.
Thanks so much for having me, Estelle. I'm really excited to be here. Love the show, and congrats on your book launch.
Thank you so much. So Brendan, tell me and tell our listeners and watchers now, we're on YouTube, about Narratively, sort of its genesis and where it is today.
Narratively launched a little over 10 years ago, coming up on 11 years ago, which is hard to believe. Doesn't feel like we've been doing it that long. And at the time, I was a freelance reporter working for the New York Times and elsewhere. Co-founder Noah Rosenberg was doing similar things. And so were a couple other friends and colleagues who we'd met. And we all felt like we had the same experience of, as journalism went online, there were more and more outlets, but increasingly it just felt like they were all doing the same thing, chasing the same kind of politics, gossip, celebrity stories. And we all kind of had the experience, of like, coming across a great story in the course of our reporting, an ordinary person who just had an incredible life story that felt like it deserved to be shared, told in depth. And when we tell an editor and they'd say like, oh, that's cool, it's great, can you like get it to me tomorrow, see if you can find like 4 other people like that and make it a roundup, which is fine. I did lots and lots of roundups and top 10 lists in those days. I even had like a formula for how you write a top 10 list, like don't put the worst one first, start with the second to best. Or anyway, that was fun, but we all kind of felt, like we still wanted to tell those kind of magazine length stories, even as journalism was going online. And there were some other outlets that I think launched around the same time that had a similar outlook. So we started meeting just at bars in New York once a week, and people would invite colleagues and friends and workshop this idea. And we launched in 2012. At first, we were just New York stories, kind of these slice of life, colorful characters from around New York. We quickly heard from both writers and readers in other places around the country and the world who were saying, hey, when are you going to launch stories from LA or London or Mumbai? And we kind of realized that if you like these types of stories, you like them regardless of where you're from. So within our first year, we started publishing stories from elsewhere as well. And the site and the company have kind of grown organically since then. really with this focus on profiling ordinary people, the kind of story that slipped through the cracks that you might not have seen elsewhere, that really surprise people and introduce them to a world or a subculture or a happening that they haven't heard of before.
Yeah, when I was editing for you, it was before the pandemic, and I think I phrased it as the extraordinary stories of ordinary people at the time.
Yes. Yeah, that's the term we use. Yeah.
That was a number of years ago. Is that still the focus?
Yeah, absolutely. Ordinary people with extraordinary stories. We like to say we profile people who, for the most part, readers won't have heard of, right? Like you might, in most publications, you're kind of reading about the same kind of people who run the world, right? Like we want to profile someone that you've never heard of. We have kind of refined our focus a little bit in recent years. When we started, we were doing one story a day, which didn't feel like a lot to promise, but was a lot to promise. So we tried a lot of different things. We did a lot of different types of stories. Now we're only running a few feature stories a month. And really, what we've zeroed in on is we want every story to be the kind of thing that surprises readers, that really makes someone say, wow, I've never heard of this world or this subculture or this person before. And that also has kind of a real dramatic, cinematic narrative full of lots of colorful and exciting and dramatic scenes. And we've said all that for a couple of reasons. One is just those are the type of stories we like to read. They hold our attention. Two is that, all the things about people's attention span online that we've heard are true and are getting truer. Like our brains are actually changing and it's harder to focus on things. And there's just so many things online that are competing for your attention. So with an online publication, it's even more important than in a print magazine that, stories really feel like each section is exciting and make you want to keep reading. And then the last thing is that this kind of happened organically at first, is we had a lot of success with folks reaching out from TV and film production companies and studios in Hollywood wanting to option some of our stories. And in the last 4 or 5 years, we focused more intentionally on that, building up relationships with studios and screenwriters and producers, and really trying to pursue projects, both documentary projects and scripted projects, inspired by every story that we publish. We have about 30 different TV and film projects in development right now in various courses of development. And so we're thinking about that kind of upfront when we think about a story, how it unfolds. What's the long tail here? Could this be a nonfiction podcast? Could it be a feature film or a TV series? And so we are kind of looking for stories that have that kind of color and cinematic quality to them.
Yeah, I remember when we were talking, you said a story can't just be beautiful writing, just lyrical, beautiful writing. It has to have something happening. It has to have that narrative, those scenes, that arc, because I think there was a misunderstanding, maybe in the literary community, that narratively just published beautiful writing, which it did, but there had to be more than just the writing.
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying that, because that's part of how we've refined our focus a little bit in recent years. We did used to publish more stories that maybe were just like a really good essay, a really well-written essay. We're still interested in really good writing, right? But we're more interested in the idea and what happens in the story feeling really unique and surprising. To be honest, like that to me is more important than the writing. I'll work with any writer. I don't care if you won a Pulitzer or if you've never written before. If you've got something I've never heard of, I will work with you on it. So really, the content, what happens in the story is more important. And it's also more about kind of externally what happens than that kind of internal essay reflection, right? More about scenes and moments that happen in the story than about what the writer is thinking. And I don't have anything against those types of kind of like internal essays. I think there's some good outlets for those as well. It's just kind of what we've decided to focus on the other part of it.
No, and I'm glad that we're talking about that, because I think that that's one of the ways that narratively sets itself apart from other publications that might do more literary writing from time to time. What about, you also said that if something's been in the news a lot, if it's a subculture, but it's been written about a lot, it's not usually the right fit for narratively. Could you expand on that and say if that's correct?
Yeah, that's definitely correct. I mean, again, we like to surprise readers. We want the majority of our readers to have never heard about the thing that you're telling us about, right? I think a guideline that I always give our editors is I say, if you're bringing me a story, it should be one that you went home and told your roommate or your significant other about, right? Like it's one that you're like, I just learned about this thing from this pitch. Like, isn't that cool? If you're not doing that, it's kind of like, well, why are we sharing it with the world? So that's kind of our standard there in terms of having that type of surprise. We will cover issues or subcultures that people know about already, as long as there's a new way in or a new thing that happens in the story that's really surprising. A lot of times, a really frequent kind of line of feedback I give to a pitch is I might get a pitch about profiling an interesting subculture. And unless it feels, really one of a kind, like I've never heard of that, just profiling that subculture might not be enough, but we want to know what happened. Find a story in that subculture, right? Like you're really interested in, sumo wrestling in Japan. Like, okay, we've heard of that. That's a great setting. I bet there's lots of colorful stories there. So we wouldn't do a this exists story on that, but can you find an epic love story in that community, a feud with lots of angles, a murder mystery, or a person who's really disrupting that community and doing something really surprising there, or a sumo wrestling community in Alaska. Like that's the type of thing that like we want to see, that type of surprise. Like, oh, I haven't seen that kind of take on that story before.
And I remember I would get a bunch of stories in that somebody was maybe abused by a relationship or a partner, and they were lovely written stories and they had a lot of pathos and heart to it and also some themes. But at the time you were concerned, is there a third act? Are they doing something? Are they now an advocate for an organization? Or can you talk a little bit about that? Because there are standard types of stories that there's always the abuse or the alcoholism or, the things that mess people's lives up. How does that get addressed?
Yeah. And I think again that might be an area where one in the past we might have run some more essays about things like that if they were just really well told and relatable. But we're really interested in pieces that again surprise us, right? So like I do feel like writers tend to pitch us that this is a terrible thing that happened to me, or trauma, profiling a group of people, whether it's this country or around the world. And like sometimes you sound terrible when you sound like a jaded editor when you're like, I'm not surprised by this, right? But it's true, right? Like we want to find an angle or an outcome that is really surprising. So we're absolutely, like, a lot of our stories focus on trauma, focus on tough things people have been through, but it is more about the surprising outcome. The person who has been through X and wow, that's really surprising that they ended up at Y. They ended up doing something to kind of either help other people who've been in that same situation or whatever it is, So it's kind of not a story being relatable is not quite enough, right? Like we want it to be both relatable and telling us something that's really surprising.
Interesting. When I edited there, I edited some humor stories. One Ivy Eisenberg wrote about kind of a
Yes, that's a great
transition,
one.
a funny story that I mentioned in my book, actually. And another one about a man who was a fainting man. He fainted everywhere. And so it had humor, but it also kind of had a message. Ivy's was a story of transformation, a funny transformation. She kind of ended up where she started from. But can you talk a little bit about humor and what you like? And, a lot of people think they're funny, but funny is very subjective.
It's very subjective. I would love, love, love to get more funny stories like that along the line of those two. I feel like because we cover a lot of tough things and because we're very dramatic, people tend to pitch us like really sad things, which is again fine if there's trauma, if there's sad parts of the story, but absolutely we'd love to see more pitches with some humor in them. We want kind of some stories that will will make you laugh. That'll be really surprising. They don't, I wouldn't say that we have like a humor section and a serious section. A lot of our stories kind of hit on both because they're really about the human experience, right? One story we published that's been one of our most popular and also really successful in TV development last year. It's about 3 generations of women in a small city in Alabama. A woman, her mother, and her grandmother who run a sex toy shop in a state where selling sex toys is technically illegal. And so that's just like, it's the type of thing you're like, wow, I want to hear about these women's lives. I want to hear what that's like, right? We probably wouldn't have profiled 3 women running a sex toy shop in Manhattan because that's not surprising. But in small town Alabama, it is. And there's some really serious parts in that piece. Like, the writer Hallie Lieberman gets really up close and personal with the women, talks about some trauma they've been through, some conflict they've been through together. But there's also really funny parts where the grandma is like learning what sex toys are, and like, where the preacher's wife is coming in and is like, don't tell anybody I'm in here, but I'm really excited about this store. So, there's like, that's a good example of one that I think has humor and kind of spotlights the really interesting moments. And then a lot of our stories that I think focus on subcultures or pursuits that you might consider weird can have a lot of humor in them, right? But we want them to have humor and heart. We want you to go into the story saying, wow, that's so weird. Why would someone do that? And then come out of it saying, all right, I can kind of understand why these people are attracted to this, whatever it is. So we kind of want to have that humor and heart in all the pieces.
So, Brendan, you have a couple of categories throughout.
Mhm.
So you have secret lives, you have memoir, you have historical. Can you talk about historical a little bit and how somebody should make sure it's not a Wikipedia entry when they send it?
Yes, really good question. So yeah, with our hidden history stories, we look for a couple of things. We look for someone who, like anything, most people haven't heard of, right? So we're not interested in profile of someone who we all learned about in high school. Also, definitely helps if they were overlooked for a reason that, we're all realizing that they should be celebrated now, whether, it's a woman or a person of color or another underrepresented person who kind of didn't get the credit or attention they should at the time, but did something really, really interesting and groundbreaking. And then lastly, we want to have those scenes. Even in a historical piece, we want the reader to feel like they're watching a movie or to feel like they're standing there alongside the person experiencing this. So there's got to be enough information that you can actually draw scenes about what happened in that person's life and kind of show us, not just tell us, not just be a Wikipedia entry, right? So whether that's from, again, depending on how long ago the story took place, it might be interviewing people who knew the person. It might be going through the historical record and finding first person primary sources from the time. But there's kind of got to be enough source material there that you can show us moments from their life.
It can't just be somebody going to the History Channel and saying, oh, okay, that's a story I haven't seen written about, even though it's been filmed, right? That's the kind of...
Yeah. And again, kind of, we want most people to have not heard about it. So I would say whether something's been covered for us is not just whether there have been big articles about it. If it's something that there's been a really prominent book or a prominent movie already made, that's probably not right for us. But if it's someone who really hasn't been covered kind of in mainstream culture much, then that's the type of thing we're into.
I always ask people, I said what we were looking for, and I asked them to tell me their ideas. And I was the first gatekeeper, ran through some things I knew just wouldn't fly it wasn't right narratively. But do you want for an article a pitch, for an essay the fully executed essay, or are you okay now with getting a pitch for an essay?
Yeah, we're okay with a pitch or a submission for either one. I know at one point we did, and honestly it was when we were focused more on kind of essays, more shorter pieces. We were saying, all right, for memoir piece, show us a draft before we see it. At this point, we're open to either. If you have a draft of the story, and I would say send it along. It helps us to read it to see if it's right for us. But we're very open to pitches for any of these. And again, like I'd say, like, I know people kind of use the word differently. I'd say we don't really do essays at this point because I think of an essay as more kind of an internal piece. We absolutely do memoir and we do first person pieces, but in a memoir piece, we're still looking for those kind of colorful scenes and really showing us things as they happened rather than telling us about what happened. So, you know, what we ask for in a pitch, and it's kind of all outlined in our submittable page, is we want to see, you know, an overview, a headline, what the story is about, an overview what it's about, and then also a breakdown, kind of a mini outline of what those main scenes, what the narrative of the story is going to be, and what kind of unfolds in the story.
And that is on your submittable now. Everything goes
Yeah.
submittable.
Yeah. I know sometimes people think submittable is like just a slush pile, but I do think it's a good place to pitch us. It has all of our kind of guidelines for what we're looking for, and also has, you know, a breakdown of what we like to see in a pitch. And if you follow those guidelines, I think that's really the best way to get through to us. You know, as we say in there, we're always looking for kind of a compelling headline, something that can really tell us in an interesting and succinct way what the piece is about. A lot of times writers are kind of like, well, I don't know, the piece is about this, and then this happens, and it's kind of about this. And I get that, but then it's probably not quite right for us yet, unless you can really zero in on this is what the story is about. It's about this woman who does this. It's about these people who do X. Like, we want to see that kind of a headline, and then give us a little rundown of kind of what actually will happen in this story. For kind of our deep dive section, which is more in-depth reported stories, sometimes you may not have all of the scenes that happen yet, right? Because you're pitching us more to go out and do the reporting. And that's okay. In those cases, an overview of like what you're hoping the story will be, who you're planning to talk to, and what you're hoping to uncover is kind of what we'd want to see.
And what's the word count?
We're really not prescriptive on word count. We know we like to say each story is the length it needs to be. You know, most of our pieces end up being something like 3,000 to 4,000 words, but we go longer sometimes too if the story really feels like it deserves it. And we're open to shorter ones too. You know, really, we want to tell a full story with a dramatic narrative arc, kind of that 3-act structure, and make sure every scene, every section of the story moves forward quickly. That ends up kind of usually being about 3,000 words or so, but we're totally open to shorter too. If you can tell us an exciting story with that kind of narrative arc that's shorter, we're open to that.
So some of the things I've seen in different Facebook groups is somebody says, oh, I had this experience where I went running for the first time, and they'll say, send it to narratively. And I'll think,
I know. I feel like, I mean, and it's our fault because we might have published that 10 years ago, right? It could be a good story for somewhere else. But yeah, we want to know, like, we did a story about a former hitman in the mafia in India who became a champion marathon runner. So that was interesting, him going running for the first time. That was a surprising change of life. But yeah, we want to see that I went running for the first time and it changed my life, and now I'm a completely different person, right? And I don't know. So yeah, we're definitely looking for something a little more unique than that.
Yeah, or I'll see, I became a foster parent at 50, and then they'll say, send it to narratively. I'll think, well, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. You know, I do feel like, again, we used to publish a story every day. We used to publish a little bit more. So we were a little less picky just in terms of like how unique the experience is. But what we're focused on now is more like, bring me that one story that you're like, you're really going to be surprised by that.
And because you have like 30 projects, film projects and TV and other projects, it's like you're thinking more cinematically, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And what is the pay? Because everyone asks.
Absolutely. I feel like writers have gotten better about asking that in recent years, not feeling like it's taboo. Our rates start at $1,000 and go up a little bit from there. We can, for more ambitious features, we can do 1,500. Sometimes 2,000 if there's like a lot of reporting involved.
Okay. And what about the contract? You know, a lot of writers are
What about
told
the contract?
number one, don't ever give away film rights or movie
Yeah.
rights. I mean, they're told
Yeah.
that in groups. I'm in a lot of groups and it always happens. So maybe you can address how that process would work and how open you are to discussion, that whole thing.
Yeah, I totally understand that perspective. We spent a lot of time talking to writers, talking to our agents, talking to our lawyers about how we can kind of arrive on a contract that works for writers and works for us and what we're trying to do very actively in the TV and film space. So our contract basically, of course, gives us the right to publish the story. It gives us the right to pursue TV and film projects. Writers do keep print publication rights with our story. I know that all of our stories, that's often like the biggest thing for writers. They got a story, they think they might want to turn it into a book. We haven't really done anything in book publishing yet. So like it makes sense for writers to keep that and have that option. And yeah, our contract does give us the right to pursue those TV film projects. Our, as I got into a little bit and happy to more, it's really kind of a main active focus of ours is to build out these TV and film projects. For every story, we really are working with the writer to think through what kind of projects might be there, actively pitching it to the contacts that we've built up in Hollywood before the story published and after the story published, and then working to produce the story and keeping the writer both involved creatively, and also the writer receives a share of any proceeds that we do get from if a story gets optioned, which means that the producer has the right to pursue that story. If it gets purchased, which means they're actually going to make it. And then if there are royalties on the back end as well. So kind of our contract outlines this, but at every step we're sharing all of the revenue with the writers. So we really see it kind of as a partnership where it's not like we're just kind of taking the rights, and if someone one day wants to make a movie out of your story, we get paid, the writer doesn't get paid, right? What we're doing is we are both publishers and producers. So we are working with you to shape the story into something that we think is really exciting and engaging, and that also will attract attention from Hollywood. And then we're working with you to try to get the project made, and sharing the revenue with writers as well. So it is kind of a unique model. It's what we've settled on, is both what we're excited about and what's working in terms of bringing revenue in and allowing us to kind of keep this publication going. So I totally get it that writers are hesitant sometimes to kind of be like, okay, I'm signing away rights. We see it less as like you're signing away rights, as more as you're starting a partnership with us to try to get your story published and then try to get your story turned into a larger project as well.
Thanks for clarifying that. And
Yeah.
so you're not just saying you're signing your life rights away or something like that. It's specific to the story, right?
That's a good thing that you brought up with life rights too. It's specific to the story. And if it is a memoir piece, our contracts do not ask for life rights. There was one version early on when we first started doing TV stuff where lawyers gave us a contract with life rights. So like, if anyone's like 6 years ago, narratively asked me for life rights, he's lying. Like we have in the past, and we quickly realized that was not a good idea and not fair to writers. So here's kind of how it works. When we're pursuing a TV or a film project inspired by your story, and someone options that story, that gives them the rights to create a project inspired by the world that we wrote about in the story, right? If someone wants to tell your life story and use your name and everything that happened to you in their story, they would need a separate life rights deal with you. So we're not asking for life rights in there. So if you write a memoir piece for us and then we team up and we pitch it, and someone wants to make a biopic about your life that's explicitly about you, they're going to have to do a separate life rights deal with you that you would negotiate at that point.
Got it. Great.
Yeah.
Can you give some editing and writing tips to writers who want to write for Narratively?
We always want a story to start with one of the most exciting scenes in the story. It's almost like there's no room for intro. When you're publishing online, there's no room for intro. I get that you have to write that intro, like to get there, you got to write it for yourself, but that's not how we start the story was published. So it doesn't have to be the climactic moment of the story, but we always start with the most exciting, dramatic, cinematic opening scene we can find, reel readers in that way, and then flashback to the beginning. So that's one thing. Then moving forward from there, almost always, I like to keep stories chronological. So start with that scene, wherever it might be chronologically in your story, then flash back to the beginning, then tell us the story in order. Sometimes it works to jump around. Sometimes. I feel like writers always want to do that unique and creative thing and tell your story in kind of all mixed up order and go back and forth and kind of like Tarantino it, right? It's so hard to execute. And like, and again, when people reading have so many opportunities to just stop reading and do something else, you don't have a second to lose them. So almost always I will tell writers to put their story in chronological order and go forward from there. And then lastly, yeah, just like really colorful descriptions, like, don't just tell us who someone is, tell us what they're like, what they look like, what they act like. Like we should be able to kind of, see them, feel like we know them without seeing pictures in the story.
Yeah, I always call it painting a picture with words, or making it almost like a movie, how the camera would pull in and describe, you'd see the visual. And when people are self-editing themselves, because that's such an important element, you're starting strong, you're having a big opening scene with lots of whatever the exciting bits are in the beginning. What can they do to, maybe they have too many words, or maybe their words are just kind of vague? What would you suggest in terms of self-editing?
Good question. I would say I always find it helpful. A couple things. Walking away, write it all down. Don't feel like you have to self-edit on your first draft, right? Like I'm always just like, I'm writing, I don't think this is good. I don't think this is good, but I'm gonna write it all down. Walk away, look at it the next day, see if you can pick out which pieces are still good, right? I know whenever I look at a first draft, I'm like, I wrote that? I can't believe I wrote it that way, right? So I'm a big fan of just getting it all down and then going back to it and seeing what parts stick with you. If you're stuck, always having eyes on it helps. Giving to someone, just be like, can you read this? What parts are interesting to you? Because I feel like, especially in a reported piece, well, I mean a memoir too, but a reported piece where you've like gone out and got lots of different pieces of information, it can be kind of hard to then sort through like, all right, which are the parts that need to be in the story and which are the parts that don't, that I needed to know to understand this story, but I don't need to tell the reader all of it.
And I think also you mentioned the openings, the endings are so important also. I always tell my students it's really a good idea sometimes to circle back at the ending, pull in something from the beginning and have it as a through line, like in Mary Whittick's piece about that I edited about the deers and about the feud with my father and the neighbors next door. There was a through line of bells ringing in the beginning and kind of ended with the bells and how they made.
Yeah, that was really, really beautifully done. Big fan of circling back. I'm a big fan of like letting, in a reported piece, letting the subjects end it kind of on their own words. Finding a good quote that sums it up is always good. I feel like sometimes writers try to button it up too much, right? Like you don't have to tell us how to feel at the end of the piece, but find a quote from someone in the story that really sums up kind of what it is that we've all learned from this story. Obviously a memoir piece, that quote does come from you, so it's a little bit different, but yeah, end it on a moment or a quote that really sums it up. If you've shown us the whole story, you don't have to at the end say like, and this is how you should feel about it, right?
It's a good point. What are some of the stories that have done really well recently, so to give people, so people can go back and look, and I can even share them in the show notes?
Sure, absolutely. I did mention our kind of one of our recent favorites. It inspired like a bidding war in Hollywood for folks who wanted to tell their story. That's now been optioned and is really exciting. Some other ones that have done well recently. Our biggest this year so far is a memoir piece by a writer named Robert Kerbick called My High Flying Life as a Corporate Spy Who Lied His Way to the Top. And that is Robert's own personal story about his experience as a corporate spy. Basically, he was a struggling actor in New York and got recruited into this group that was hired by firms to basically use their acting skills to call up other firms and try to trick them into giving away confidential information. So there's a lot of really rich scenes and interesting color there, and it's just an interesting kind of secret life. That's actually an adapted excerpt from Robert's book called Ruse, Living the American Dream from Hollywood to Wall Street. I should say we do sometimes run book excerpts. We're open to that. What we did with Robert is what we usually do with excerpts, right? Is not just run like chapter one. but basically like we ran like a mini version of the book almost. Like we took a few interesting scenes from each part of the book because we want our story to still have a full narrative arc. We want it to make you want to read the book, but we want to kind of like show the full arc of the story, not just like show a little bit and then end on a cliffhanger.
Fascinating. I love it. So we've covered so much today. Is there anything I didn't ask you, Brendan, that you'd like to mention?
I'm not sure. I think we covered lots. I would just say also, I know that I really appreciate kind of you asking the questions about what we're looking for now and, what we've zeroed in on. I'm always happy to like hop on the phone with writers or like throw around ideas on email. Like if people want to just say like, hey, here's a world I'm interested in, here's a few potential story angles, and send those my way. We're always happy to kind of like brainstorm a little bit or give you ideas of things to look into and just talk it out a little bit. Like if you have like a fully formed story and it's done and ready to publish, great. Like that's great, but you don't have to have that. Like you can just kind of hit us up with like, here's a tentative idea. What do you think about this? Would this be the right kind of thing for me to look into for narratively? And we can talk it out a little bit.
And that would go through Subminimal as well. And then
it's also fine to email me, Brendan at Narratively, Brendan. If people kind of have just like a question or like an idea you want to run by me. I've kind of been informally doing like office hours where I'll just like find 20 minutes to hop on the phone with the writer and hear what they're working on, tell them a little more what we're working on. So that's something we may launch more formally soon. Hopefully, if you listened or watched this podcast, you've got a good idea by now of what we're looking for. But if anyone, if writers want to just like book 15 minutes to hop on the phone and talk more in depth about what kind of stories we're open to, I'm always happy to do that too. You can just email me.
That's great. I hope some of my students and some of our listeners will take that up and have the right ideas. Obviously listen and see if it's the right ideas, because Brendan's time is valuable, but it's very kind of you to offer that. So thank you so much for talking to me about Narratively, to talk about what you're looking for, what's current, your contract, your pay, how you approach and deal with writers, because I think it's really important to disperse some of the misnomers that have been out there since the publication actually started. And I think your face makes a big difference on it all.
I appreciate it. You did give me the opportunity to say one more thing, and my co-founder Noah will kill me if I forget to say the one new big thing we did. We launched a subscriber program. We're now publishing our stories on Substack. We kind of been thinking about this for 10 plus years. We feel like the time is right. So you can kind of read part of each story, but to read the full stories, readers do have to pay $6 a month or $50 a year. It gives you access to all of our new stories, our past stories, as well as audio versions of the stories, and our Storycraft section, which is Q&As with writers and kind of tips about how to pitch and how to write. So I think that's a really valuable thing for writers as well. But we're really excited to have this live now and just kind of finally start literally valuing the work that we're doing. And so far we've had a pretty good feedback from readers who are happy to pay that to be able to keep reading the stories. But I just want to mention that if people haven't been to our site for a while, if they went to it, they might be surprised by that. So I want to let people know that's live.
Can you mention any of the Hollywood projects that are out or coming out shortly?
We have, as I mentioned, the Alabama story, Dames, as we call it for short, that's been optioned for production as a scripted, fictionalized TV show. Another one of our kind of all-time great stories called The Man with the Golden Airline Ticket by Caroline Rothstein has been optioned and in production with a partnership with Amazon Studios to produce a feature film inspired by that story. And then another piece that we published a good few years ago called The First Family of Counterfeit Hunting has also been optioned and is development, again, as a scripted TV project. So meaning kind of like it's not literally going to be about the people covered in the stories, but the story kind of gives them some insight into the world. And we're creating a fictionalized TV series about that world. So those are a few that are at like various stages of development. And again, I wish we had one that's coming out tomorrow. but it's a long process, and hopefully one of them will be on air soon so people can see that's what we're doing.
Yeah, that's all. That's really exciting, Brendan. So thank you so
Yeah.
much. It's really been a
Thank you,
pleasure
Estelle.
chatting with you and hearing about everything going on with you and with Narratively.
I'm happy to. Thanks so much for having me.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.